tal? ¿Cómo estás?
Solid camera on.
Over a bit. I'm gonna move this over and I'm gonna stand under here.
Yeah, sure.
I'll move this and pick up your bag. Oh, it's not even yours. Does it matter?
Yeah.
I'll move it when the question.
Good afternoon. My name is Alejandro Ramirez, and I'm president of the Harvard University Mexican Association. In this time of renewed awareness about the importance of cross-cultural understanding, our organization seeks to promote a better knowledge of Mexico's society and culture among all members of Harvard community. As a symbol of this, we are honored to have with us today one of Mexico's greatest writers. To introduce our distinguished guest, please welcome the president of Harvard University, Mr. Neil Rudenstine.
Thank you. It's a personal pleasure for me to be able to introduce Carlos Fuentes this afternoon. He's, of course, no stranger to Harvard. He was here as professor of comparative literature from 1984 to 86. He was the Robert F. Kennedy Professor of Latin American Studies in 1987, and I'm happy to say that the university also had the wit to confer an honorary doctorate on him, so we can count him amongst our graduates. But we promise not to solicit him. You know about his writings. As early as the 1960s, he was already publishing a number of ambitious novels that now, over the years, have quickly established him as one of the most imaginative and complex writers in the world today. Several of his books have won major prizes, including more than one major award in the 1970s for his formidable novel, The Great Terra Nostra. Then in 1984, he won the Mexican National Award for Literature. What is perhaps less well known to you is that he began work in the press office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico in 1954. Later, he was head of the ministry's Department of Cultural Relations, and finally, he was his nation's ambassador to France from 1974 to 1976, a responsibility that he carried out with extraordinary distinction and great energy at a time that was very, very difficult indeed. In other words, he's been a great many things to a great many people. In the field of diplomacy, in the press, in cultural and literary affairs, he's edited many journals as well as doing his own writings, and then, of course, as a great creative writer himself. His own life, in this sense, reflects the nature of his work, and I wanted to just close by saying one or two things about that work, because it's something I care a great deal about. He is, in a sense, a citizen of Mexico, of his entire continent, of Latin America generally, but symbolically also a citizen of America, of Europe, and in a further sense of the world. He's a person who brings, as I think you know, very strong convictions, deeply held, with great intelligence, to bear on complicated and difficult problems. But he always does so with great understanding, an enormous capacity to listen, an interest in other people's perspectives, as well as having great wit, great charm, and personal eloquence. No one speaks for the author in Carlos Fuentes' novels. Every character, every voice, every position is balanced, is qualified in some way by another. So if I close this introduction by quoting a passage from his last novel, The Campaign, I do so only to suggest one continuing strain in his work, not any one position. The scene toward the end of the novel involves an encounter between a young revolutionary and a priest who is also a revolutionary. It's the early part of the 19th century, not so long after the French Revolution. The priest is leading a hopeless struggle for freedom in Veracruz, and the young other revolutionary who has come to seek him out is Argentinian. He comes, in a sense, from the tradition of the French Enlightenment and the rationalist, the anti-clerical, anti-church revolutionary trend embodied by Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, etc. In some sense, the scene in the whole book has to do with finding a way to incorporate both perspectives, as well as other perspectives, into one sensibility and heritage. In this case, the priest is speaking to the young Argentinian who has come to find him. I am not asking you to believe as I do. I'm not that simple. I am asking you to complicate your own secular faith. You've come from far, far away, and this continent is very large. But we have two things in common. We understand each other because we speak Spanish. And like it or not, we've had 3 centuries of Catholic Christian culture marked by the symbols, values, follies, the crimes, and the dreams of Christianity in the New World. I know fellows like you. They've all passed through here. I've talked with all of you for 10 years. You've given me the education which sadly I never had. I was in a religious seminary when I was young, and now that I'm grown up, I'm in the secular seminary with all of you. But let's get on with it. All of you would like to put an end to the past, which seems unjust and absurd to you. So forget it. Yes, how good it would be to have been founded by Montesquieu instead of Torquemada. But it didn't happen that way. Do we now want to be Europeans, modern, rich, governed by the spirit of laws and the universal rights of man? Well, let me tell you that nothing like that will ever happen unless we carry the corpse of our past with us. What I'm asking you is that we not sacrifice anything, not the magic of the Indians, not the theology of the Christians, not the reason of our European contemporaries. It would be better if we gathered up everything we are in order to go on being and to be, finally, something better. That whole sense of not suppressing any part of the past, of appreciating it all, but seeing it in perspective, understanding its follies and crimes as well as its dreams, of trying to incorporate it and relate the present to the past somehow, seems to me to be the very heart of what Carlos Fuentes' work is all about. I can think of no timelier or more pertinent message for us today. It's a great pleasure to introduce him to you.
Thank you very much, President Rudenstein. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be back here with you at Harvard and to listen to this very sensitive introduction by Neil that really moved me a great deal. And as I was hearing, I was reminded of a traveling monk of the 13th century whose name was Hugo de Saint-Victor. And he traveled around Europe teaching and said the following: a very imperfect person is he or she who are only happy in the land of their origins. A bit more perfect is he or she who are happy in the other places they go to, but it is truly a happy and perfect person who is a stranger everywhere, who is unhappy everywhere he or she goes. Well, I'm very happy to be in the second position and hope to remain there as much as I can. And one of my preferred places, of course, is here with you at Harvard, and being able to say hello again, to meet again with Neil and Angelica Rudenstein, to revive very fruitful discussions and a great friendship we've had over the years in Princeton, in Venice. It is wonderful to remember the life at Harvard and the great honor it was for me to inaugurate the Robert F. Kennedy Chair in Latin American Studies, which is now held by my very eminent colleague, the Peruvian novelist Mario Vargas Llosa. But it is particularly a happy event for me to be here, invited by the Harvard University Mexican Association and its very active head, Alejandro Ramirez Magaña. The relationship between Mexico and Harvard is old and deep. There are many generations of Mexicans who have been through Harvard, and indeed the relationship has been so successful that we have come to believe in Mexico that you need a Harvard degree in order to become president of Mexico. Ladies and gentlemen, October 12, 1992, tomorrow, marks the quincentennial of a great, if debatable, and immensely complex event, which nevertheless we do not even know how to name. Should we call it the discovery of America, as we were taught to by tradition, or the encounter of two worlds as proposed by a contemporary conception, or the invention of America, as explained by the Mexican historian Edmundo O'Gorman, and indeed back in the 16th century by the Spanish historian Hernán Pérez de Oliva, who spoke already of the invention of the Indies by Europe? Or should we call it a feat of the Renaissance imagination, as defined by the Spanish historian José Antonio Maraval? A few years ago, back in 1951, we were celebrating another centennial, the 4th century of the founding of the University of Mexico, one of the 3 oldest universities in the hemisphere, along with those of Santo Domingo and Lima. And this was celebrated at the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico, El Palacio de Bellas Artes, with a play written by a very witty Mexican writer, Fernando Benítez, and the play was called Cristobal Colón, Christopher Columbus. Very beautifully staged. Up front on the stage you had the island of Guanani in the Bahamas and a cyclorama in the back with the ocean, and the 3 caravels advancing, the Pinta de Niña and the Santa Maria. When the Indians looked back and realized that the caravels were arriving, they started jumping up and down the stage, exclaiming, "Hooray, hooray, we have been discovered." Well, all discoveries are mutual, as couples loving or otherwise know, and and if the Europeans discovered the Indians, it is also true that the Indians discovered the Europeans and wondered whether these white and bearded men were as compassionate as their crosses proclaimed or as brutal as their swords demonstrated. On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in a small island in the Western Hemisphere. He had put his wager on a scientific hypothesis and won. Since the Earth is round, you can reach the east by sailing west. 1492 both expanded and unified the planet at the same time. The navigational feat of Columbus is unparalleled, but he was wrong in his geography. He thought that he had arrived in Asia. His desire was to reach the fabled lands of Cipango, Japan, and Cathay, China. cutting short the European route along the coast of Africa, south to the Cape of Good Hope, and then east to the Indian Ocean and the Spice Islands. It was not to be the first or the last Occidental disorientation. In these islands, which he called the Indies, Columbus established the first European settlements in the New World. He built the first churches. The first Christian masses were celebrated there. And finding a domain empty of the Asian wealth he had hoped for, he invented and reported back to Spain the discovery of great wealth in forests, pearls, and gold. Otherwise, his patroness, Queen Isabel, might have thought that her investment and her faith in the highly inventive Genoese sailor had been misplaced. In this sense, I think we can consider Christopher Columbus the founder of that subgenre of literature known as Latin American magical realism. But even more, as Victor Ouimet of McGill University in Montreal says, Columbus was driven by the need to find the confirmation of his beliefs. Columbus, he writes, went less to discover than to prove what he thought he already knew. Yet more than gold or personal certitude, Columbus offered Europe a vision that the Renaissance needed, the vision of the Golden Age restored. These lands were utopia, the happy time of the natural man. Columbus had come upon the earthly paradise and the noble savage. Why then was he immediately forced to deny his own discovery, attack the men he had so recently described? I quote him as naked, unarmed, and friendly, hunt them down, enslave them, and even send them back to Spain in irons. At first, Columbus stepped back in the Golden Age, but very soon, through his own doing, the earthly paradise was destroyed, and the formerly good savage was seen, I quote the Admiral again, as fit to be ordered about and made to work, to sow, and to do aught else that may be needed. The Golden Continent became the hostile continent, but also the empty continent, devoid of history, it was hoped, but abundant in gold, it was also hoped. Ever since, the American continent has existed between dream and reality, a divorce between the good society that we desire and the imperfect society in which we really live. We have clung to the idea of utopia because we were founded by utopia. The memory of the good society is at our origins and also at the end of the road as the fulfillment of our hopes. And we felt obliged to maintain the utopian idea of America, also, first of all, to compensate Europe, Renaissance Europe, for its own contradiction between the high ideals of the age and the base demands of religious strife and economic greed. This is the age of both Erasmus of Rotterdam and St. Thomas More, of Henry VIII and Machiavelli, of Leonardo da Vinci and Cesare Borgia. And Christopher Columbus was a man of his time, of course, caught between these lofty ideals and these concrete political demands. Numbers can deceive, but evidence does tell us that the peoples whom Columbus discovered in 1492 in the Caribbean had totally disappeared 50 years later. The North American historians of the colonial experience of Latin America, Barbara and Stanley Stein of Princeton University, estimate the population of central Mexico at 25 million people when the conquest began in 1519. In 1605, there were only 2 million people left. In the central Andes, a population as high as 6 million in 1525 had sunk to 1.5 million in 1561. The reasons for this demographic disaster were complex, cumulative, and brutal. Forced labor, European diseases, immunological breakdowns, but also, to what a degree we can barely imagine, culture shock and sheer anguish and desperation. But I don't think that numbers are the most impressive fact about the European conquest of America. One single unjust death, one single enslaved human being, or one single bird in a cage, to paraphrase William Blake, are enough to put heaven in a rage. The violent deaths with which the Europeans, Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch, implanted their power in the New World is but the statistical index of a far larger occurrence, the irreparable death of great civilizations that possessed an educational system, a moral and artistic universe of their own, and forms of human relationship in constantly evolving creativity. For next to the mystical and violent world of sacred power, which dominated the most developed Indian societies in Mexico and Peru, another way of life, young and promising, was cut at the stem, although never destroyed at the roots, by the discovery and conquest. But cutting the Indian civilizations in the bud, Europe perhaps lost as much as America. The ancient civilizations were bearers of alternative projects of relationship and imagination, social, cultural, political, economic, which our Latin American societies, but again perhaps those of Europe, have surely needed or will one day require if they are to face a host of problems for which Western modernity has no appropriate response, the relationship to nature, for example, or the relationship to death. But now, said the chronicler of the conquest of Mexico, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, looking upon the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztecs, now all that is fallen, strewn, and lost forever. But was this truly so? Did the conquest truly destroy the Indian cultures forever? In one sense, we must answer yes. We shall never know how the Indian civilizations would have evolved without foreign interference. We shall never know, it is also true, what Gaul would have turned out to be without the presence of Julius Caesar, or Iberia without the Roman conquest, or England without the Norman invasion. I mean, an interrupted destiny is never a just destiny. But if the fate of pre-Columbian America was to lose its autonomous evolution, it is also true that the very brutality of the conquest manifested the Indian capacity to survive in spite of the most violent challenges. For the Indian culture of the Americas, if it did not prevail, did not perish either, but became part of what we might call the counter-conquest. The counter-conquest, that is, the Indian presence, first of all, followed by the black response to the purely European presence in the Americas. A purity, as we all know, that lasted less than the first night of love between an Indian woman and a Spanish man. Much has been said about the astonishment of the Indian universe when the European appeared, especially when the European, who was for the Indian, the unknown, the other, seemed to embody the fulfillment of magical or mythical prophecies, which is exactly what happened in Mexico when Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, landed on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, precisely in the time foreseen for the return of the blonde and bearded god Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent. But the Indians did not have the monopoly of the imagination. The Europeans, too, held both a Renaissance imagination, willful and assertive, and a medieval imagination, fabulous, fantastic, and capable of finding symbols for everything. Another day in the morning, writes Bernal Díaz del Castillo again, we arrived at the broad causeway leading to Mexico. And there we stopped in admiration, saying that this was like the enchanted things told in the books of Amadis, in the books of chivalry. And some of our soldiers even asked if what they were seeing were but a dream, for these were things never seen or heard by men before us. His words permit us to see the conquest of America as a double astonishment, Indian and European, and as a double dream, the mythic dream of the Indians and the utopian dream of the Europeans. The melancholy writing of Bernal Díaz del Castillo and other chroniclers of the New World is that of pilgrims who first found their vision of paradise and were then forced to destroy it. Astonishment became pain, and the writer could only save both pain and wonder through the art of memory. The astonishment of Spain in America is ours as well, and we also share the pain. For the very first thing to understand about Spain, of course, is that it is a crossroads country. a land of many migrants, crisscrossed and shaped by Celts and Iberians, Phoenicians, Greeks and Romans, Arabs and Jews. There is no such thing as a pure Christian Orthodox Spain. Yet it was this Orthodox vision of Spain, as proposed by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabel, that went out to conquer the New World. In America, Spain, this multicultural country, was yet to meet another other, the Indians. When she included and embraced the Indians, she was true to herself. When she excluded and exterminated them, Spain was the greatest victim of her own self-betrayal. For Spain herself was a land conquered by many peoples, and a land that reconquered itself only when it recognized its multicultural heritage. We are to this day astonished by the painful synchronicity of Spanish time, for Spain sacrifices her polycultural vocation, Christian but also Jewish and Muslim, in the very instant in which she discovers and is discovered by the radically other, the Indian culture of the Americas. Let us recall that in 1492, several important things happened. Not only the Columbus trip to the New World, but also the fact that Spain vanquished the Arabs at Granada and expelled the Jews. But above all, there is an astonishing fraternity, a sort of brotherhood between the death of the Indian civilizations of the Americas and the birth of the Hispano-Indian civilizations of the New World. A terrible knowledge, that of being present at the very instant of our own creation, the observers of our own rape, but also of the contradictory cruelness and tenderness that went into our conception. Spanish Americans, I think, cannot be understood without this intense self-consciousness, this self-awareness of the moment in which we were conceived. A sort of magnificent pain welds together the relationship of Iberia to the New World, a birth that occurs along with the knowledge of everything that had to die in order that we might be born, the splendor of the ancient Indian civilizations. Eternal witnesses to our own creation, we, the descendants of Indians and Spaniards in the America, know that the conquest was a cruel, criminal, bloody event. It was a catastrophic event, but it was not a sterile event. Maria Zambrano, the great contemporary Spanish philosopher, once wrote that a catastrophe is truly catastrophic only if it does not give birth to something that by going beyond the disaster, in effect, redeems it. From the catastrophe of the conquest, all of us, the Indo-Ibero-Americans, were born. We were immediately mestizos, that is, men and women of both Indian and European blood. The vast majority of us speak Spanish. And whether or not we believe, we created ourselves inside the culture of Catholicism, but of a Catholicism bathed in syncretism and unexplainable without its Indian first and later its black African masks. We are in Spanish America something like the face of the extreme West, a face tattooed with Indian and black scars, but also, lest we forget, born also with the profiles of Jews and Arabs and Greeks and Romans. Born from two cultures of death, the Spanish and the Indian, we witness the birth of a culture of life. Neither crime nor utopia, the events of the discovery and conquest of America were perhaps something more. They became the permanent pause. They became the permanent pause of our historical memory, forcing us to think and rethink ourselves constantly in order to be able to transform our experience into knowledge. And from the very start, we asked ourselves the questions of identity. Who are we? What is the name of this river? What was that mountain called before? Who were our fathers and mothers? Do we recognize our brothers and sisters? What do we remember? What do we desire? And from the very start also, we proposed the questions of justice. To whom do the fruits of land and labor legitimately belong? Why do so few have so much and so many have so little? On these questions, a new civilization was created. And its hubs were our great cities, a necklace of true Indo-Afro-European cities of the Spanish-speaking Americas, from San Francisco and St. Augustine to Buenos Aires and Santiago de Chile, Havana, San Juan de Puerto Rico, Lima, Cartagena de Indias. No one ever built so much with as much energy and in so short a time and over such a vast space as Spanish America, cities with printing presses, universities, poets and philosophers, 1 century before any of this came to being here in Anglo-America. But also cities built on injustice, cities whose energy, imagination, and contrasts were also a kind of painful compensation for the life that had disappeared in the onslaught of the conquest. On these questions and in these cities, we created a Baroque culture where the defeated found a refuge for their ancient beliefs under the cupolas of Christianity and forever left their native imprint on the churches, the civil architecture, the literature, the arts and crafts of a continent where the Baroque was more than it was in Europe, where in effect the Baroque became the art of the New World, the roof over the heads of the defeated peoples. And from these Baroque spaces, we ask these questions. What was our place in the world? To whom did we owe allegiance? To our Indian, Maya, African mothers, to our European fathers? To whom should we now pray, the ancient gods or the new of the new gods? The Baroque of the New World opened a space for all of these questions and made us realize that we were caught between the destroyed Indian world and the enslaved Black African world, and a new universe, both European and American. Beyond the world of empire, then, beyond the world of empire, of gold and power, beyond the wars between religions and dynasties, a brave new world was indeed forming itself in the Americas after the conquest, with American hands and voices. A new society, a new faith, with its own language, its own customs, its own needs. But of course, the most important reality arising from the new Afro-Indo-Iberian culture of Spanish America had to do with basic questions of justice. And in the response to these questions, Spain played a singular role in the history of the colonizations of the New World. The day before Christmas in the year 1511, the friar Antonio de Montesinos rose and startled his colonial parishioners in Santo Domingo by denouncing their treatment of the Indian population. "Are these not men?" he exclaimed. "Have they not rational souls?" The sermon by Father Montesinos has been called the first cry for freedom in the New World. And it culminated in the new laws of Indies of 1542, which were the result of another crusade, that of Father Bartolomé de las Casas, in defense of the Indians against the abuses of the so-called encomienda system, the encomienda being a disguised form of slavery to exploit Indian land and labor. These new laws abolished the encomienda and were a source of constant friction, of constant conflict between the in situ practices of the conquistadores and the Crown's efforts to protect the Indian communities and give them at least a clear judicial status over their lands. But along with the practical considerations, what sets Spanish colonialism off from the others is that during one whole century, Spain, the most extensive empire the world had known, was the only empire of its time and the first in history to debate with itself on the nature and mistakes of its colonial policies. What have I wrought? Who am I subjecting, educating, evangelizing, exploiting? Are these only beasts of burden? Are they not human beings? Do they not have a soul? Who are these men and women? What are their inalienable rights? And furthermore, are there just and unjust wars? Is there such a thing as a right to conquest? Only Spain did it, not the other colonial powers whose crimes of enslavement and extermination were certainly comparable to those of Spain, but without the doubt, the debate, the discourse, and at times even the humor that permitted the greatest intellectual advocate for the human rights of the American Indians, Father Francisco de Vitoria, to ask his Spanish students from his chair at the University of Salamanca, what would you, my Spanish students, have thought if instead of conquering the American Indians had crossed the Atlantic, conquered Spain, and treated us the way that we are treating them? Vitoria's arch enemy was the jurist Ginés de Sepúlveda, who accused the Indians of cannibalism and human sacrifice in a society, he said, not very different from a colony of ants. The Indians, being pre-social men, they could be legitimately conquered by civil men from Europe, and all their goods given civilized ends, argued Sepúlveda. But were not the Spaniards, argued Vitoria right back, also guilty of crimes against nature? Were not all European nations culpable of acts of destruction and war? If this was so, no one had the moral right to conquer the Indians. From this debate was born the modern concept of international law based on the universality of human rights, which another great Spanish intellectual of the 16th century, Father Francisco Suárez, a disciple of Vitoria, explained by placing the origin of all authority in the people. For this reason, he said, no people can be legitimately subjected to conquest by others. Spain and Spanish America universalized the idea of human rights, and the legality, which imperfect as it was, derived from this conception, was in practice superior to the two alternatives, utopia or crime, that nevertheless continued their lengthy lives in the New World. The legal protection accorded by the Spanish crown to the peoples of the vast agrarian hinterland of the Americas was certainly insufficient. The local political bosses, the caciques, quickly filled in the vacuum open between the very distant monarchy in Madrid and the concrete interests of the landowning and mining oligarchies all the way from the Sierra Madre to the Andes. The encomienda system was abolished, but the hacienda, based on debt peonage, took its place. Yet we can argue that the peasant and Indian communities had greater rights over their land, water, and forests during the colonial period than during the period of national independence from Spain, which began in the 1820s. Friedrich Katz of the University of Chicago recalls that only in the case of Mexico in 1820, 40% of the land was still in the hands of the Indian and campesino communities. A century later, only 2% of the land was still in their hands. For the newly minted Spanish-American republics identified economic liberalism with progress, and agrarian culture, including Indian culture, as barbarism. This rationalization permitted our republican governments to strip the agrarian communities of their aboriginal and even of their colonial rights, depriving them of the legal recognition that they had had under the colonial regime. The independent republics imposed free market values on the defenseless Indians and campesinos. The theory was that in a system of free competition, they would rapidly become true owners and exploiters of their soil. In reality, the big haciendas simply gobbled them up. This was the reason for the modern agrarian revolution, such as that of Emiliano Zapata in Mexico, who did nothing but reclaim rights given to the Indian and campesino townships by the crown, by the Spanish crown. But I think that the important thing to remember in 1992 is that 5 centuries later, the conquest is not over yet. And we, the modern Latin Americans, have behaved with as much cruelty or indifference towards the Indians as Cortés or Pizarro, and certainly with less compassion than Vitoria or Las Casas. And I am not only referring to the genocidal campaigns against the Indians waged by the governments of Argentina, Chile, and Mexico towards the end of the 19th century. I'm referring not only to the cultural scorn with which writers such as the Argentinian Carlos Bunge could bless alcoholism, smallpox, and tuberculosis, since they helped to wipe out the Indian and African population of the Americas. I refer rather to our own daily indifference, our oppression through lack of concern, our constant marginalization of the Indian peoples of the Americas. In this, as in most matters, our reflection about 1992 should address itself to the future rather than to the past. Let us ask ourselves if 500 years from now there will be a single Indian left in the Americas. We must decide whether we are able to respect the values of Indian culture, their extraordinary sense of community, of the sacred, of the fact that everything is related to everything else, the care of nature, the concern for memory and death, the atavistic wisdom, the ritual intensity, the presence of mystery, indeed the capacity for self-government, thus making them as far as we can our own, thus admitting the value of the other who lives in our midst. Or perhaps the Indians of the Americas are only telling us that they are also part of our wider cultural community, asking us not to condemn them to oblivion, but to save them from injustice, warning us that if we forget them, we forget ourselves, making us realize that we will never be just if we do not share justice with them, and that we will never be satisfied if we do not share our bread with them. For bread and injustice are indeed scarce in the Ibero-American New World 500 years after Columbus. And this injustice, this insatisfaction forces us to ask ourselves if in 1992 we have anything to celebrate. The answer would at first glance be negative if we observe throughout the Latin American world the ravages of the so-called lost decade of development, the 1980s, the ravages of inflation and unemployment, the growing poverty and sickness, the diminishing salaries, savings, and productivity, not to speak of the loss of hope, the loss of expectations. Our fragile democratic institutions are menaced by social explosions and indeed, in some cases, perhaps by military takeovers. Is there then anything to celebrate? I would say, in spite of everything, that there is. Not only in 1992, but every single day and every single year, we have the occasion and the right to celebrate the great cultural wealth, the cultural continuity of the Ibero-American continent. In the midst of our economic disasters, in spite of our lack of political unity, and in flagrant contrast with both, cultural continuity is the most evident and positive fact of the life which we have been able to create as descendants of Indians, blacks, and Europeans in the American nations that speak Spanish and Portuguese. The negative crisis has been positive in at least two aspects. First, we have become aware that this has also been a huge crisis of development, more than of underdevelopment, of development, wide, explosive, and disorganized. We're approaching the doors of the third millennium and the fifth centennial with a population that has doubled in 20 years, from 200 million in 1970 to 400 million today, and which by the year 2000 will double the population of the United States of America. It is a young population. Half of it is 15 years old or less, 200 million teenagers and children. It is a population hungry for jobs, education, social services. Every single Latin American who will demand a job by the year 2000 has already been born. But none of our prevalent political or economic systems has been able to give these young people what they deserve: health, education, employment, but also political freedom, or economic development, but with jobs, schools, and hospitals. We have had social justice without economic development or political democracy. At times we have had economic development without social justice or political democracy, or social justice and economic development, but again without political democracy. I think it is time to join all three values: economic growth with social justice and political democracy. That is why we have witnessed the downfall of many political theories and economic models that were scarcely related to our cultural realities. But in the midst of these disasters, something remained on its own two feet, and that is the culture we have created during the past 500 years. The emergence of culture as a protagonist of Latin American life, which it was not in the past, has come accompanied by the emergence of the civil society as the creator and bearer of the culture. So that we have seen the worst of ourselves in recent years, but also more clearly than ever, the best. From the poetry of the Aztec lyricist to that of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in colonial Mexico, to that of Pablo Neruda in our contemporary lives, we, the Indo-Afro-Ibero-Americans, have proved ourselves capable of creating a fluid, continuous, lasting culture in which each and every one of us recognizes him or herself and recognizes the other Latin Americans. So that the crisis that economically impoverished us also put this wealth in our hands. Few cultures in the world, I think, possess a comparable continuity. That is why we so sorely feel the lack of connection, the lack of recognition of the bonds between culture, politics, and the economy. In other words, we have been unable to translate our cultural richness and continuity into a comparable economic wealth or political imagination. In fact, many Latin Americans more and more are asking themselves, why have our writers and artists been so imaginative and our politicians so unimaginative? Yet I must immediately say that when I speak of a colonial Baroque poet like Sister Juana or a contemporary one such as Pablo Neruda, I know that these are aesthetic facts, totally valid as such unto themselves. That is, in themselves, an Indian temple or a Baroque poem or a contemporary novel do not demand economic or political responses. But they do indicate, of course they do, ways of being, modes of thought, styles of life, of cooking, furnishing, loving, singing, dancing, moving, talking, dreaming, struggling. A cultural fact thus conjugates and symbolizes a whole manner of being. Culture is the way in which we answer the challenges of life. The products of our contemporary culture, novels and poems, architecture, music, film, architecture, all tell us this is the way we are. This is what we can accomplish. This we have yet to do. This we would like to be and do. The lack of a concrete, more clear correspondence between the cultural unity and the political and economic situation of Latin America worries me because it points out, to be sure, to an incapacity, a vacuum. We have not achieved this correspondence because very frequently we have searched for and imposed on the culture models of development scarcely related to cultural realities. That is why culture can give us a necessary vision of the real coincidences between life as it is lived, imagined, and created culturally, and the life of economics and politics. Culture, after all, is created by those who also create and bear the economic life. All of us, the citizens, the members of the civil society. Perhaps we have made the culture, but have been unable to make the politics and the economics. This is, in my view, the great novelty of Ibero-America as we approach the year 1992, but also beyond it, the year of a new century and a new millennium. Traditionally, our societies are being organized from the top and from the center. This is true of both the Aztec or the Spanish empires. The disappearance of the Spanish Empire in the Americas suddenly left us without a roof over our heads. We were shelterless after 300 years. And this created a political vacuum which was promptly filled in by the tyrants, men such as Santa Anna in Mexico or Rosas in Argentina, and a challenge to go beyond tyranny, first filled by the emerging national states as imagined by men like Benito Juarez in Mexico or Bartolomé Mitre in Argentina. In the conflict born of creating national states in the midst of military putches, foreign interventions, and persistent anachronisms, in the midst of elections and mass movements of both evolution and revolution, but also thanks to the creation by the national states of previously inexistent infrastructures in health, communications, and above all, education, the civil societies of Latin America have slowly been forging themselves in adversity, in an uphill fight, but also with the certainty of being the bearers, the creators, and the bearers of the cultural continuity of the hemisphere. Labor unions and agrarian co-ops, entrepreneurial organizations, bureaucrats and technocrats, women's organizations, civic and religious groups, universities, the media, students, and intellectuals. This extremely wide fan of the civil society is today, I think, the most dynamic reality in Latin America. And its novelty is that it moves from the periphery, from the margins and from below, instead of being imposed from above and from the top, as has traditionally occurred. The dynamics of the civil society in Latin America as we approach 1992 is rapidly going not only beyond the traditional power structures, the church, the army, the state, but also leaving the political parties behind, regarding them as not truly representing civil society. The civil society seems to have, in other words, outgrown the political institutions from Mexico to Argentina. The danger in this situation, of course, is that the civil society will not have sufficient time or sufficient organization to give concrete responses to the rapidly evolving challenges of our modern end of century, instant communications, accelerated technological change, and worldwide economic integration. It is with these cards in our hands, the aces as well as the deuces, that we're going to present ourselves to the dates called 1992 and the year 2000. Not, I hope, to celebrate, but to reflect, as we're trying to do here tonight at Harvard. For the problems of 1492 and 1992 might well be the following two, one of them to celebrate too much, the other to deplore too much. To see our past only as a protracted crime, or to see it only as a civilizing epic, only as feat or only as defeat. The fact is that from the events of the past, good and bad, all of us have been born. We are what we are because we made the culture that unites us. And this culture has Indian and African and European roots. Above all, it is a mixed culture, a mestizo culture, and a culture that predicts, that forecasts the nature and the problems of the world in the coming century. For the world in the 21st century will resemble our Latin American world more and more, and the European world of modernity triumphant less and less. To begin with, the world will be racially mixed, and we will live in a world of migrations, but this time they will be instantaneous, not in caravels, but in jets. Every single one of us in the Americas is a migrant. We all came from somewhere else, starting with the first men and women who crossed over from Asia across the Bering Strait 30,000 years ago, right down to the last migrant worker who only last night crossed the Mexico-US border at Tijuana, San Diego. Without forgetting those famous undocumented workers, the pilgrims who landed on Plymouth Rock in 1620. Please recall then, when thinking about the quincentennial, that ours was once an empty continent, that we all came from somewhere else, and that if we deny any group or culture the right to be in the Americas, we deny ourselves that very same right. But also remember that we are all the descendants of multiple cultures in the New World, and that we would not be who we are without our ancestors, their languages, their dreams. We're all part of a family of cultures. 500 years ago, we in the Americas faced the problem of meeting the other men and women, members of another race, another culture. The same phenomenon is repeated on a daily basis today, but on a worldwide scale, from New York to Los Angeles, from Berlin to London, and from Paris to Naples. In the 21st century, we shall witness mass migrations from east to west and from south to north. I hope that the modern migrant finds his father Bartolomé de las Casas and can be defended by his father, Francisco de Vitoria. Our own experience in Spain and Iberoamerica has been that we have attained greatness when we have been capable of including the other. But when we have excluded he or she who are not like you or me, we have failed miserably. When we exclude, we are poor. When we include, we are rich. The strength of our culture, the most important dividend of these 500 years, lies precisely in this knowledge. On it, I hope we can act responsibly both inside and outside our nations. Inside, we must strive, especially in Latin America, to reach a greater coincidence between our societies and our institutions. Today, they are dangerously divergent. Only if society and its institutions truly represent each other can we in Latin America renew economic development, but this time with social justice and with political democracy. 500 years after Columbus, our countries demand no less. And outside, the Iberian New World has, I think, the sufficient cultural identification to open up and embrace without fear all the cultures of the world. The cultures of France, of England, and the United States, of Anglo-America, to recall but two examples that gave us insomnia during 200 years, sleepless nights. Could we ever be like the French or the English? Are not stronger or richer than ours, I think. We can resist all encounters and benefit from them. An isolated culture soon perishes. Only cultures in communication with other cultures flourish. We are all that we have been. We cannot deny either the greatness or the servitude of our past, our virtues or our sins. We cannot, in other words, deny life or death. But we will only continue being in the future if we face it consciously, with all the burdens of our history, but with all its promises as well. There is a world after the quincentennial, and it is a world in crisis, a world of gigantic challenges in every single sphere of life. We in the Hispanic world, I think, have much to offer the future, if only we do not paralyze or self-paralyze, rather, in pure celebration or in pure browbeating. Between festive beatitude and self-persecuting masochism, Indian, Black, and Iberian America have the opportunity to be truly modern if we do not deny any aspect of what we have been, as President Rudenstein read from that passage, which is very important for me. We want neither utopia nor apocalypse, but rather alternative, a creative life in tension between alternative visions and competing values. We are in the world. In it we are free, of course, because we act, but we are not free because we die. Only culture, by which I mean love and friendship, creation and criticism, memory and desire, assure the continuity of life in spite of the inevitability of death. It is on the basis of this set of experiences and doubts and beliefs that we in Iberoamerica can try to give a real critical human content to the demands of our time. I think we can do it by firmly standing in our history of encounters and incorporations, which began 500 years ago, and thus benefiting the new multipolar world that must succeed the past 50 years of a sterile, bipolar Cold War. I believe that a world order of multiple centers will finally prevail simply because in the absence of Cold War spooks and crusades, every one of us, North and South, East and West, will be forced to take stock of our internal problems, which we have been sweeping under the rug for decades, discovering that the true, neglected, but most dangerous enemy is inside ourselves and our societies. There is now a third world inside the first world, of course, and our cities share more and more the same problems. It is a unique event that for the first time Latin America and the United States should have so many problems in common, perhaps even more than the problems that separate us. The same problems in Caracas and New York City, in Lima and Detroit, in Los Angeles and Mexico City, in Atlanta and Rio de Janeiro, problems of the homeless, crime, drugs, violence, the status of women, standards of education, healthcare, the elderly, poverty, pollution, urban decay, economic injustice, and the bonds of solidarity and cultural identification needed finally to solve these problems. This is what discovery means today, perhaps discovering ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, when we speak of two dates, 1992 and the year 2000, we're speaking of time. Time and how we deal with it, how we shape it. Time is many things for many people. The ancient Mexicans both feared and celebrated a succession of 5 suns, los cinco soles, that announced beginning and end, death and rebirth, while the ancient Peruvians imagined time as a series of horizons that fused into each other, always unreachable, but always open. But perhaps the most beautiful Western definition of time is due to Plato, who said time is the moving image of eternity. In this image that moves, in this succession of suns, into this fusion of horizons, we ourselves inevitably act and think, speak and write, hope and remember, and live and die. Let us learn in 1992 and as the new century dawns to respect the pauses of time without forsaking the movement of time. Let us animate the plurality of our culture so that more and more they will reflect their values in our political institutions, giving them vigor, substance, and a greater sense of justice. And let us learn to go beyond the discovery or the encounter towards the imagination of America, the unfinished, unaccomplished, challenging imagination of our continent and the world, because, ladies and gentlemen, at least in one thing Columbus was right, we will only discover what we have first imagined. The next 500 years begin today. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes, and Carlos has very kindly volunteered to answer some questions. So if we have some, I will be glad to call on people and try to be fair in terms of scanning the room for a few moments. Yes.
Liberation theology has liberation theology has as its source and its norm the experience of the individual in the context of his times, his or her times. And some theologians, like Gustavo Gutierrez and Juan Luis II, would say that this is not an inappropriate way to, is not an inappropriate voice for the plight of the poor. Can you speak to that and give special note to how you understand the hermeneutic of justice of the church and of Catholicism?
Yes. I think that I used to say this, the time is gone, perhaps I can't repeat it anymore, that no two things change so more from one country to another than the Communist Party and the Catholic Church. They were very, very different for a long time, and the church continues to be different in many countries. It has not played the same role in Mexico as in Chile, in El Salvador as in Argentina. So we have to make these distinctions, because there are countries where the church hierarchy has been extremely conservative, and there are others where the church hierarchy has been very close to the people. As in the case, as I just said a moment ago, of El Salvador during the civil wars, or in Chile during the Pinochet regime. And of course, the theology of liberation, the church theology behind this, has sustained the churches that really want to come near to the people and help to integrate them into organizations that, of course, have to go beyond the purely religious into greater realms of cultural, economic, political, and social identification. So in the measure that the church works with the civil society in order to strengthen the civil society, which is a way of strengthening the culture and making it more informative of the political and economic structures of each of our nations, it is a very welcome fact and a very identifying fact. Because after all, the school, that Latin Americans, the political school that Latin Americans went to for 300 years was the school of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. They continue to be our basic philosophers. I don't want to imply that St. Thomas Aquinas invented the PRI in Mexico, for example. No. But the philosophy of St. Thomas, in the sense that the common good is the great aim of political society, and that it is better reached through one will than through a plurality of voters, has, you understand, it is almost self-evident, animated a lot of the political thought of Latin America. The Augustinian idea that grace is not directly available to he or she who has faith, but that it must be somehow transmitted, passed through the church hierarchy, is another very important idea in Latin America. In the measure in which the church itself today and Christians in Latin America contribute to shake up these hierarchical theologies and enter a theology that is more modern and more congenial to the building of the civil society, I think it'll play a very, very important role along with the other organizations of the civil society. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. You spoke of...
Go up to the, if you want to make a question, go up to the microphone.
Yes, there are microphones.
Yeah.
You spoke of culture as a primary protagonist in contemporary Latin America and said that the civil societies are moving, driven by that culture, past the political parties. But I wonder in the case of some group like, for example, the PRI in Mexico, where the culture of the society has adopted and is much centered around images that work to the advantage of the party, so that it's hard to separate Zapata, Pancho Villa, the revolution, from the image of the PRI. How, not just in Mexico, but generally in Latin America, how can the people get past the ways that the culture has been, in part, monopolized by certain political traditions or political parties?
Well, you know, what's happening in my country is very interesting in this sense, and I'm glad you bring it up, that curiously, the PRI and the state in Mexico are themselves shedding many of the political symbols and legitimations that kept them going for the past 50 years. In a very practical sense, the privatizations that have taken place in Mexico, especially under the Salinas administration, have meant that the source of money and patronage for the PRI and the state in many cases has dried up. If you look at it's interesting, if you look at the latest textbook for the 6th grade in Mexico, there is a downgrading of the figures of Zapata and Villa that used to be such a source of legitimacy for the institutional revolution in Mexico, and that the very identification with the idea of revolution is more and more being left behind, so that the system in Mexico, the PRI itself, is renouncing so many of its former sources of legitimation that one wonders if it is really losing the faces it could offer in the sense that you are talking about, and actually opening itself up more and more to the action of the civil society. Listen, when a governor in Mexico goes through the process of being actually named by the PRI and going at times through a fraudulent election, at times not fraudulent. Whatever the source of the fact that he is in the governor's palace, if he refuses to deal with the civil society, if he refuses to deal with the 800, 900, 1,000 organizations that in his local state have sprung up to defend the rights of women, the rights of campesinos, cooperatives, media, information, unions, laborers, entrepreneurs, a million things, religious groups, he will be out in a very short time. In Tabasco, a governor during the 1980s who dealt with the civil society, had a successful government. A political hack who followed him and refused to deal with the civil society was out in a few months. So the civil society is there imposing itself, its dynamic, its action from the margins and from below as against actions imposed from above, which are getting weaker and weaker, so that we're seeing a lot of change in many states in Mexico, a change in the whole configuration of the political spectrum. The recent events in the states of Guanajuato, of San Luis Potosí, and now Michoacán prove it, as well as the internal rift within the party of National Action, PAN, of the right, yesterday. So I think that more and more the parties are trying to adapt to the prime mover and the prime shaker, the prime dynamic element of our society in Mexico, which is the civil society. As I say, it is a movement which is uphill, which will have many martyrs. When you see the case of a country like Peru, where on the one side you have almost de facto a military government by Fujimori, on the other side you have a murderous Pol Pot guerrilla, the Shining Path, and in the center the civil society being really triturated by them, being blown up as an eminent fighter of the civil society. Maria Elena Moyano, a worker for education, was blown up by the Shining Path, who put explosives under her skirt and blew her up in a public square. Then you see how uphill the fight is, but it is there, and I think you cannot understand what is going on in Latin America if you do not pay attention to this extraordinary and vigorous new movement where the culture and the society come together.
Yes, I have a question. Before says that during your whole talk, in fact, you mentioned several times that the mestizo, the combine between the Spanish and the Aztec cultures. But what is your opinion? What is your comment about how the Mexican, sometimes they don't perhaps accept that they are Aztecs, or perhaps they don't accept that they are Spanish. Like they have some problems perhaps with the acceptation of identity. Would you like to make some comment about that? What will be the most...
Yeah. Well, first of all, I try to speak of a very broad range of mestizaje, which includes not only the mestizaje of Indians and Europeans, also of blacks and Europeans. It's a very wide range. In the case of Mexico, since you're asking me about the Aztecs, the case of Peru would perhaps be different. On the contrary, I think we have tried to idealize the Indian past. We have tried to idealize the Aztecs. We think this is glorious, magnificent. We devote museums to them. We honor the past enormously, but we do not honor the present sufficiently. What we do not honor is the Indians living in the present among us, as I tried to imply in the speech. Yeah.
What sort of impact do you think, if any, will there be on Mexico if there's a free trade agreement, both economically and culturally?
You want me to give another lecture, huh? I'm game. I think it's very difficult to judge the free trade agreement right now in a moment of economic recession in the United States. It disfigures the whole agreement, and in an election year when it tends to become a political football. But if we try to I'm trying to be objective here and trying to look at the Mexican reasons, and if you wish, we can see the U.S. reasons in a minute. I think that, of course, Mexico is being driven mostly by the desire to enter to export into the US market, a vast market of consumers such as yours, without trade barriers, for which we ourselves have lowered our own tariffs and trade barriers almost to the point of non-existent. There is the hope that this will bring investments and jobs and less migration from Mexico to the United States. Let me say that we should be very conscious of the costs of these benefits, if you will. There is, first of all, an immense cost of simply catching up with the United States and Canada in order to be able to compete with them. I think that if my figures are correct, I have many young economists here, Mexican economists in the audience. It'll take the private sector of Mexico only, it'll cost about $23 billion in the next 4 years to bring up to a certain competitive standard our infrastructure, our communications, a number of things that we have to have. Already many of our industries have fallen prey to the fall of protectionism in Mexico. The toy industry, for example, has disappeared. In Mexico, toys are not us, definitely, because all the American toys have invaded the market. And I wonder what will happen to a very weak agriculture, such as we have in Mexico, facing two of the most efficient and subsidized, let me underline, subsidized agricultures in the world, those of the United States and Canada. Well, we have negotiated that, for example, the corn market will not be open in Mexico before 10 years to see if we can catch up. We think we will be able to export many things better and in greater quantity to the United States, glass, shoes, cements. I don't know much about these details, but I do know something, and that is that at the bottom of everything, what we are discussing is a new model of development, and not only for Mexico, but for all of Latin America. I think we have come to the conclusion that we are dealing with an exhausted model, which is the model of so-called substitution of imports, a captive market, high protectionist barriers, and development fueled by external debt. We have substituted it with a liberal or neoliberal economics throughout the hemisphere, but I think we're rapidly seeing also the limits of voodoo economics, as someone eminently called it in this country. And that is that trickle down doesn't trickle. And that if you have great macroeconomic successes and you clean up the public finances, as has happened in many countries in Latin America, still you have the problem of economic development reaching the majority of the people, of economics being not only a phenomenon of the stock exchange, but something that has to do with education, daily life, jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So we are right now in that stage of discovering that there is more to liberal economics than just following in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, that we must give it a cultural content and take quickly the advantages of the new economics to the majority of the people. It is a political challenge, therefore, as well. I think that in your country, if we look at the other side of it, we are speaking of interests of the US government in stability in Mexico. In Mexico, we ask ourselves, many ask ourselves, is stability only economic? Is it not also political? Can you have only economic reform without political reform? I think that the facts will impose themselves. They are doing so more and more in the sense that we must have political reform along with economic reform. The United States has to strengthen its position vis-a-vis other economic blocs, Japan, the European community. It is sending to Mexico investments and jobs that would leave the United States in any case. Don't forget that. If these jobs do not go to Mexico, they're going to the Pacific. They're going to Malaysia. They're going to other countries where it will benefit Japan more than it will benefit you. In a sense, Japan should be more opposed to the North American Free Trade Agreement than anybody in the United States. But again, I think that what is being debated is the place of the United States, the future, the economic future of the United States in a highly integrated, technological, capital scarce world economy of the future. And the question is, are you going to be a second revolution backwater? Are you going to become the Luddite widow of the advanced technological world, while the Japanese and the Europeans go more rapidly than you? We are all aware of the problems of the free trade agreement, of the pain it causes. A worker in New Mexico a week ago said, well, I'm a blue-collar worker, and I've lost my job, and it's gone to Mexico. And this causes pain. What do you tell me? I said, I know it causes pain, and it pains me to hear you. But please, do not ask Mexico to solve your problem. Ask your government to train workers at the level that the Europeans and the Japanese do. You are not getting sufficient retraining, sufficient education for a new economy, for an advanced economy in this country. You could become a backwater. You could enter industrial decadence in an advanced society, so that the problem behind the free trade agreement for us is what kind of model of development are we able to create with our present resources, with our culture, with our political experience, with the transformations we need. And yours, I think, is the larger problem of where will the United States focus its energies in a new global economy. Thank you.
This summer, the world witnessed the second Cumbre Iberoamericana between Spain, Portugal, and the Latin American countries. And do you think that this marks a future of much more political and cultural integration between Spain and Portugal and Latin America, based on the fact that historically there are much more similarities and parallels between the two regions than differences? Or do you feel that Spain and Portugal will be kind of closed off from Latin America due to their participation in the European community?
Well, I hope the second isn't true. I think it would be a nasty birthday gift indeed if Spain and Portugal closed their doors to Latin Americans, demanded visas from Latin Americans in order to comply with obligations under the European community rules. I think it would be very, very severe. I think that the two meetings in Guadalajara and Madrid have created a greater political union and consciousness between Spain, Portugal, and the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries of the hemisphere. But I think there is still very much to prove in the sense of common action, of things, practical things we can do together. We're talking about education, for example, things we could do together for education, for agriculture. But I think there are also political things we can do. For example, the present government of Nicaragua, headed by Violeta Chamorro, is trying desperately to achieve a sense of balance or equilibrium with the real political forces of Nicaragua, which include the Sandinista party, which is still the majority party in the Congress. There is a constant sabotaging of this policy of equilibrium on the part of the US government and elements of Congress such as Jesse Helms. It is demanded of the Nicaraguan government that it do certain things that please Jesse Helms and the United States, or Nicaragua will not receive $104 million that were promised. This kind of blackmail, I think, should be overcome by the action of the Latin American community. I really propose that the Ibero-American community give Violeta Chamorro $104 million, which is not very much, and say to Jesse Helms, forget it. Forget it. Thank you.
Carlos Fuentes, thank you very much. We've had an exhilarating time, and I think we see in action the kind of merging of literary, political, cultural, and every kind of sensibility that you bring to us. Thank you very much.
Bueno, yo que la otra constitución no puedo ni el miércoles ni el jueves.
Tú dices que esta ya que entramos mañana. La otra.
Todos los días menos miércoles y...
Bueno, es una serie. El martes, yo el martes por ejemplo.
No puede porque el martes...
No, yo ni no puedo por el martes.
Fernando, por lo que ha dicho ella, el martes.
Sí, claro.
Se llama
Mañana. ¿Qué te ha parecido? ¿Qué te ha parecido? ¿Será que fuera muy...
No,
ha sido
a mí
muy...
me gustó la cosa de criminal.
Bueno, las
La
palabras
cosa
se
criminal,
no, porque no me
no, pero usó para la conquista, usó la palabra criminal. Pero no esperaba.
No, esperaba, digo, oye, si yo estuve hasta dudando, digo, mira que te voy a decir que no insulten, porque es de miedo él.
Sí, es de miedo.
El juez es de miedo. Y no ha estado muy prudente, ¿eh?
Sí,
ha estado muy prudente. Yo lo encontré. Él lo he oído también a él publicar a los Estados Unidos y los ha puesto.
Utilizar la palabra criminal para esa época, es que para la época, para una cosa